Hello, everyone. Welcome to A Good Night for a Murder, a Victorian true crime podcast. My name is Kim, and at the end of every episode, I usually ask you, the listening audience, to let me know what you thought about the story I just told. But tonight, I really want to know what you think. On the surface, it's a Black Widow story. Or is it? I'm not so sure, but as usual, I have done my best to separate fact from fiction and to give you the full story. This is the story of Black Widow Louise Vermilya. But first, a Victorian Society tip. In honor of Valentine's Day and the month of love in general, just in case it's taken me until after Valentine's Day to get this episode out, I am going to share with you 4 Victorian Lonely Heart ads. I've shared Lonely Heart ads before, both on this podcast and on social media, and since I've read more than a few now, I can tell you that the Victorians actually had pretty much all the same problems we do today when it comes to dating. There were catfish, there were scammers, there are those who are actually better off hiring a maid. We'll start out mild and get more unhinged as we go. It sounds like this first man wants, someone else's pre-trained wife. He wants a wife to do wife things. The ad reads, wanted, an elderly woman, farmer's widow, or other good woman who is neat and tidy to correspond with me with a view to matrimony. Will give a good woman who will assume the duties of a wife a good home. The next man started out fairly benign until he threw in that you can also have all of his dead wife's jewelry as a selling point. Wanted, a match for an independent, beautiful young widower of 36 years of respectable and very rich family. Possesses handsome amount of thousands and numerous golden ornaments of his previous wife. I guess some people wouldn't mind, but what else does he expect me to have or wear of hers? Also, I want my own things. I'm not looking to get haunted by any first wife. Onward to bachelor number 3, though. He writes, a middle-aged gentleman of 40 whose family includes 1 earl, 2 baronets, 1 bishop, and a dozen beneficed clergymen, possessing a small fortune of £1,000, also a university and medical education, with the accomplishment of music, which he also composes, wishes most ardently to meet a lady who would accept the entire devotion of his hand and heart. The lady's age under 50, with the education and manners of a gentlewoman, and either of fortune or industry sufficient for her support. He is bald, but will wear a wig if the lady wishes. It actually says that part about wearing the wig, which I think is super cute. Let's dress up and wear wigs. However, the part about either having a fortune or industry sufficient for her support, that is a bold statement from someone who opened by listing all of the members of nobility in his family. Suspicious. This last bachelor, however, is certainly not looking for a wife, despite what they say. Wanted, a young lady about 17 or 21 years of age as a wife. She must be well acquainted with the necessary accomplishments of such. She must understand washing and ironing, baking bread, making good coffee, roasting beef, veal, boning a fowl, broiling a fish, making tarts, plum puddings, and desserts of all kinds, preserving fruits and pickles, expert with the needle, keeping a clean and snug house, must know reading, writing, and arithmetic, never been in the habit of attending the ballrooms. She must have been taught true and genuine principles of religion and a member of a church in good standing. She must not be addicted to making too free use of her tongue, such as repeating any report that is injurious to her neighbors, or using taunting language to any person about her house. Any lady finding herself in possession of the above accomplishments will please address Alfonso. Sir, you were looking to hire a cook, also a housekeeper. You just don't want to pay them, though I'm sure you can, because taking out these personal ads was not cheap. If he had the money to list all of the recipes he wants his wife to make, he might as well just hire help. Though I bet he probably tried that and couldn't even pay them to stay either. Now he's got to try to gaslight some young 17 to 21-year-old. Get out of here, Alfonso. Before we dive in, I have some new Patreon welcomes to share this month. Welcome to first-time members Mary and Stacy Jean. Thank you so much for supporting the podcast. I am so glad you're here. A Good Night for a Murder is a true crime podcast that does cover stories including death, violence, sexual assault, and other adult themes. Please take care while listening. Louise was born in July in 1868 in Cook County, Illinois. Her parents were Prussian immigrants Wilhelmina, or Minnie, and John Wolfe. She was the third oldest out of 11 siblings. She had 6 brothers and 4 sisters. On April 2nd, 1885, when she was 17, Louise married Frank Brinkamp. Now, I cannot find a concrete birth date for Frank Brinkamp, so I don't know exactly how old he was, but based on the ages of his children and grandchildren from his prior marriage, it appears he was somewhere in his 50s. It sounds like he had 2, maybe 3 children, though I'm thinking they must have been nearly grown by the time he married Louise. It does sound like his 5-year-old granddaughter Lillian was in his care, though. So they're married, 17-year-old Louise and 50-something Frank, and they moved to a farm in Barrington, Illinois, where, so far as I can tell, they have 3 children together of their own. Their children were Cora, born literally the same year they were married, Frank, born 2 years later in 1887, and Florence, born another 2 years later in 1889. An unusual anecdote is related by the town undertaker, Mr. E.N. Blocks, from Louise's time in Barrington, which was that he couldn't keep her out of the mortuary. He said, "While I never employed her for a couple of years, I couldn't keep her out of the office. At every death, she would seem to hear of it just as soon as I, and she would reach the house only a little behind me." Now, I'm going to guess that the reason this anecdote is included in the source material I used for this episode is because hindsight is 2020, and this just fit the narrative. We all already know that Louise is going to go on to do some despicable things, but keep in mind, Louise is a very young mother, married to a man more than twice her age, and come to find out, in the year 1892, she tried to file for divorce from Frank, citing cruelty as the reason. Now, no articles I saw mentioned that. I only found it in a small newspaper clipping on her Find a Grave memorial. So I don't think we can judge too harshly that maybe she sought out sanctuary by hanging around the local mortuary with the kindly undertaker who, it sounds like, just let her come and go as she pleased. But from here on out, it does seem like something snapped in Louise. In 1893, the year after Louise filed for divorce, her husband Frank died. The coroner ruled the cause of death as a heart attack. He was in his 60s, after all, they said. After this, Louise inherited $5,000 from their life insurance policy. Very shortly after the death of her father, little Cora Brinkamp, who was only 8 years old, also died. Sources also report that Louise's youngest daughter, Florence, also died in quick succession after her sister, but I can't actually verify this. A couple of years later, around 1899-ish, when Louise is in her mid-30s, she moved to Chicago and married Charles Vermilya. I'm going to be honest, the records were not very good, and it was a challenge to sort out all of the kids and how old they were. But to Chicago, she brought with her her son Frank, who would be about 19 now, her 2 older stepchildren, and also her step-granddaughter Lillian, who is now in her early 20s. In 1906, Lillian died from acute nephritis. Nephritis tells us they thought it had something to do with her kidneys. It's agreed that the modern diagnosis of most nephritis cases would be diabetic kidney disease. So probably not a particularly quick death, not too suspicious, but rumors that the Brinkamp family might be cursed started to arise due to the high number of deaths in the family. Towards the end of July in 1909, Louise's husband Charles became suddenly violently ill with stomach pain and vomiting. After about 1 week of this, he was not getting any better, and he died on August 1st of 1909. The cause of death was ruled as gastritis. Gastritis is just what they called anything that involved a stomach upset. He left Louise with $1,000 in cash and a home in Crystal Lake, Illinois. Now, sources say that Charles' stepson Harry argued with Louise about the inheritance of the home, and he also died shortly thereafter. But this is not true. Charles' son Harry had predeceased him. I know, because it said so in Charles' obituary. Charles did have 2 other sons, but they lived much longer lives than this. I cannot deny, though, that the quick death of her second husband does sound suspicious. Onward with our story, though. In 1910, Louise's son Frank died and left her an inheritance of $1,200. Upon his deathbed, he confided to his fiancée that he thought his mother had been involved in the death of his father. He was also said to remark that he was, quote, going the way his father did. I think this is just another one of those things that fits the narrative in hindsight. This makes it sound like Louise was also responsible for the death of her son, but I think those remarks are taken out of context because Louise was nowhere near Frank at the time of his death. He was in the southeastern United States, and the cause of his death was malaria. I mean, he was 6 when his father died. He could have just seen him looking unwell in bed at some point and said, I saw the same thing when my father died. So far, what he saw or heard that made him suspicious of his mother's part in his father's death, I cannot speak to that. There are more strange events in 1910 that Louise was directly involved with that we have to talk about, though. On January 15, 1910, a railroad fireman named Jason Rupert was boarding with the Vermilyas. He reportedly became very sick after eating a meal prepared by Louise and died 2 days later. To what end would Louise want to kill her boarder, though? We have no idea. By the next month, Louise had taken on another boarder in her home named Robert Smith. And apparently, the two struck up a whirlwind romance and were married. Hardly a month later, on March 11, 1910, Robert Smith died of gastritis. 2 days prior, he had eaten a meal prepared by Louise and had become very sick. Now, it turns out Smith had an estranged wife when he married Louise, so if there was any life insurance money to be had, Louise got none of it. After this, she met Mr. Arthur Bissonnette. Louise became a good friend to Arthur and even helped him to get accepted into what was called the Home Guard, a militia-like entity for men who were unable to qualify for the military. In return, Arthur agreed to name Louise as the beneficiary of the insurance policy offered to him through the Home Guard. In October of 1911, Arthur and his father dined at the home of Louise, where Arthur was boarding by now. They both became very ill, and Arthur died shortly thereafter. Arthur's family asked for an investigation. In the investigation, it came out that Arthur's father had seen Louise sprinkle white pepper over their meals immediately before serving to them. They performed an autopsy, and it revealed Arthur's cause of death was arsenic poisoning. It's for the insurance money, right? Turns out, though, that Arthur actually named his fiancée, who was living in another city, as the beneficiary. After this, Louise was arrested on October 28 and put on house arrest. We will never know why, but during this time, she apparently started dosing herself with the suspicious white pepper. After a few days, she had slowly been getting sicker and sicker and needed to be rushed to the hospital on November 4th. Maybe she thought it would delay her trial, or she could lay blame on someone else if they saw she was sick too. Whatever her reason, if she had one, it didn't work, and 2 days later, she appeared in court in a wheelchair to be arraigned for the murder of Arthur Bissonnette. By November 9th, papers were reporting that she likely wouldn't live to see her own trial. Whatever she had taken, plus the stress of her arrest, had brought on an entire slew of health problems now, to the point where her doctors were worried her heart would give out. On November 24th, though, she was discharged from the county hospital, but she was still far from well. And on December 9th, it sounds like she suffered a stroke. Despite this, prosecutors continued to pursue her trial, but on March 7th of 1912, the charges were dropped. It had been discovered that Arthur was taking medication that contained arsenic, which made a conviction unlikely. Prosecutors were not done with Louise Vermilya yet, though. After the results of Arthur's autopsy, an autopsy was performed on Robert Smith as well, which also revealed arsenic. The prosecutor stated, "There are several cases as to which Ms. Vermilya may be tried, and I don't want to try her more than once. For that reason, I want to pick out the strongest one, and I have concluded the Smith one is the strongest." Louise was quickly rearrested and charged with the murder of Robert Smith. While in custody, it was reported she tried again to commit suicide for a second time. Her trial for the murder of Robert Smith began on March 21, 1912. It lasted 16 days but ended in a hung jury. The case was resubmitted for trial 10 days later, but again, ended in a hung jury. At this point, the jury selection had become problematic. Everyone had heard of and had an opinion on the case. And most men were unsure they would be able to inflict the death penalty on a woman. Women were not allowed as jurors in the state of Illinois until 1937. Further, any potential jurors who had a problem with circumstantial evidence needed to be excused. By October of that year, Louise was still in custody, but her health was failing. As summer approached, there were concerns about housing Louise in the non-air-conditioned jail. So, bail was set and paid at $5,000, and Louise was released. On April 18, 1915, it was decided it would be impossible to obtain a conviction on the Smith indictment. It was deemed that another trial with the same evidence would be expensive with little consequence. And so, at the request of Louise's attorney, the charges against her were dropped. It is estimated that Vermilya amassed a total of $15,000 from the deaths she is suspected of. $15,000 back then would be nearly $490,000 in today's money. After the dismissal of her charges, Louise apparently led a quiet life. This was likely due to the toll her incarceration had taken on her health, as she only survived another 3 years. She died on December 31st in 1915 at the age of 47. She was buried in the Forest Home Cemetery in Forest Park, Illinois. I do not know if she shares a plot with them, but her 3 children, Cora, Florence, and Frank, are also buried in the same cemetery. I'm unsure where her first husband was buried, but her second husband was buried in Crystal Lake, Illinois. Both are likely buried with their first wives. Though she was only tried for the murders of Arthur Bissonnette and Robert Smith, it's often reported that Louise Vermilya is suspected in the murders of a total of 10 people. I honestly think that's a tad inflated, though. So let's recap, and I'll tell you which I actually think she may have been responsible for. We'll take them chronologically. So first, her first husband, Fred Brinkhamp. This seems plausible. Perhaps she did it for the insurance payout, or perhaps to escape. Second, her 8-year-old daughter, Cora. There was no evidence for this, of course, but perhaps she was motivated by not wanting the burden of a young child in her care as a single woman. Third is her 4-year-old daughter, Florence. Now, Florence did die as a child, but sources are very conflicting on the timeline. Some say it was right after Cora and made it seem like Louise was on some sort of killing spree. Others show Florence's death to be after she married her second husband. So for that reason, I can't take the claims that she was one by one murdering her children that seriously, but who knows. Fourth, she's also said to have murdered Lillian, her 26-year-old step-granddaughter. Again, cannot prove nor disprove, but I have no clue what her motive would be there. Fifth, her second husband, Charles Vermilya. Again, possibly motivated by the insurance payout, as we do see a bit of a pattern develop later on. Sixth would be her stepson, Harry. I firmly believe she is not responsible for this, as I found evidence that he died before his father. Seventh is her own son, Frank. Another one I don't believe she's responsible for, as he died far away from her. Eighth is her boarder, Jason Rupert. There is very little information about this, and it doesn't make much sense that she'd murder a tenant. But as I said earlier, there does seem to be a bit of a pattern about to develop. And that emerges with the 9th and 10th alleged victims, Robert Smith and Arthur Bissonnette. Now, these two were autopsied, and she was charged with their murders. So by this point, I have to say, it does seem to be some sort of insurance scam she's running here. But if that were the case, she was actually pretty bad at it. Neither would have given her any money, and she got caught. So I feel like potentially 5 to 6 victims is more accurate. I'm curious to know what you think about this case, though. Do you think she's actually guilty of murdering all 10? And what do you think her motives were? If you head over to Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube at A Good Night for a Murder, you can let me know there. I've posted some photos of Louise and more. You can also see the photos and source links for this episode on the episode blog on my website at agoodnightforamurder.com. The bonus content for Patreon members for this episode is another Black Widow case, and just like the story of Louise Vermilya, I'm very divided on if she was actually the villain or the victim. Listen through the outro music to hear a short preview of this Patreon bonus content. To subscribe to Patreon and learn more about the podcast, you can visit agoodnightforamurder.com. Also follow me on Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube at A Good Night for a Murder. Please rate and review and share with friends. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you again soon. And this is to accompany episode 47 about Black Widow Louise Vermilya. I'm going to tell you the story of another woman that history has branded a Black Widow killer, Martha Needle. Martha was born on April 9 of 1863 in Morgan, South Australia. From the get-go, Martha had a rough upbringing. Some sources say her father died early on in her life, while others say her parents split even before she was born. In 1870, her mother remarried to a man named Daniel Ferran, and they had 2 more children together. The family were quite poor and lived in a small 2-room house in North Adelaide. Martha's mother was an alcoholic who had, quote, convictions for drunkenness, indecent language, and willful damage. She would often beat Martha with a stick or a rope. At the young age of 12, Martha's stepfather was arrested for sexually assaulting her. For this, he received the maximum penalty of 2 years. Shortly after this, Martha left home, and can we blame her? When she was about 17 or 18, she met and married Henry Needle. Their first daughter, Mabel, was born in 1882. Their second daughter, Elsie, was born in 1884. Their marriage was described as a happy one, and in 1885, the family moved to Richmond, a suburb of Melbourne. Some say after this is when things started to take a turn. Around that time, her oldest daughter, Mabel, who was only 3, started to get sick. She suffered fever, vomiting, and spasms of the stomach. Martha had no explanation. She just said the girl suddenly, quote, seemed to fade. And doctors couldn't seem to offer much in the way of help either. Mabel did die from this illness, and the attending doctor certified her cause of death as cerebral tumor congenital and respiratory and cardiac bronchitis. After this, the relationship between Martha and Henry rapidly deteriorated. Henry had trouble finding work locally and had started to travel to Sydney, where he would be away for months at a time. During this time, Martha started going out alone and seeking attention from other men. Henry, while he was at home, was often quite jealous and would punish